Uh, Good evening. I'm Diane Kresh. I'm director of the Arlington Public Library and delighted to welcome you this evening to our first of two Arlington Reads events. This is our nonfiction evening, and next week we will be hosting Tim O'Brien, who's the author of The Things They Carried, our two companion pieces for this year. Arlington Reads is now in its sixth year, and I'm pleased to say that last year's program on food sustainability recently received an Outstanding Achievement in Local Government Innovation Award from the Alliance for Innovation, an international network of progressive governments and partners, and that'll be presented to us later this year. Each year, Arlington Reads uses reading to create community and focus on a contemporary issue or theme of interest to county residents. This year, we present The Soldier's Story, Serving Country and Community, a theme that speaks to the residents of Arlington, many of whom are military families, and it supports the County Board's Telling Arlington's Story initiative. Our guest author tonight is David Finkel, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter from the Washington Post. His critically acclaimed The Good Soldiers, in which we meet the men of the Rangers Battalion, has been called the most unforgettable book about the Iraq War, both heart-stopping and heartbreaking. To say that The Good Soldiers is about the horrors of war is a little like saying Catcher in the Rye is about an alienated adolescent, or that Bernard Malamud's The Natural is a book about baseball. The Good Soldiers is about the horrors of war, and so much more. It is about abstract concepts like duty, obligation, honor, and trust. It is about decisions and strategies, commitments and beliefs, bonds of friendship and survivor's guilt. It is about revealing the hidden place and about bearing witness to human tragedy and failings. It is about the paradox of good, the good soldiers, good people. It's all good. David has spent much of today having lively exchanges with Arlington High School students who read the book. We were meeting both with New Direction students and journalism students at Yorktown High School. And tonight it's our turn to hear David offer fresh documentation of an age-old story. Men and women may leave a war, but it never leaves them. It's my pleasure to welcome our 2011 Arlington Reads featured nonfiction author, David Finkel.
Thank you. I want to start off with some necessary and enthusiastic thank yous to Diane, and to Margaret Brown, and to the library. It was, when I was writing the book, or when I was waiting for it to come out, friends who had written books said, so there's some really great moments ahead. When you get the cover, that's a great moment. One day the cover showed up in the mail. I liked the cover, that was nice. The book came out, I held the thing in my hands. That was nice. But there was a day when I was out reporting, and I can't remember what town I was in. I was just passing through a town. I had time to kill, so I went into the library, and there was the book. And it had that wrapping on it, that clear wrapping, and you knew in a couple of years it probably was going to have that library scent to it, and I swear, just seeing the book in that place where I didn't expect to see it meant and means so much to me. I mean, I just love libraries, so I'm glad to be here. And thank you to you. This, it's a nonfiction book about a war that hasn't been terribly popular, and to see you all here tonight, it means a lot, and I thank you for coming. And please don't look to your left and see the gorgeous weather and the people playing tennis, just eyes front, eyes front. The book I wrote is called The Good Soldiers. It's a piece of journalism, it's a piece of observed journalism. It wasn't done by phone or email. It's a type of journalism where you just go and you stay and you stay and you stay until you think you have a story to tell that's a true story. I guess you could say the book is about the Iraq War. More specifically, it's about a period in the Iraq War known as the Surge. And more specifically than that, I think the book is about any war at all. My intent wasn't to write a book about the Iraq War, but to use that war to write a book about the character of young men who enter a war at pretty much the lost moment, and to chronicle and to document what happens to them, what war does to them over the course of their time in this place. In this case, in this particular case, the soldiers belonged to an Army infantry battalion out of Fort Riley, Kansas, called the 216, nicknamed the Rangers. Past all that, it was 800 guys. And forgive me for saying guys, but this was infantry, and except for support positions, everybody was male. 800 guys, average age 19. Most of them hadn't been out of the country before, hadn't been to war before, and the rest of their life began to take shape on the evening of January 10th, 2007, when George W. Bush went on TV and announced this new strategy called the Surge. And as he went on, at one point he said, something like, many listening tonight will wonder what the differences will be this time. Well, here are the differences. And he went on to elaborate, to enunciate what the differences would be in this strategy. But there was a guy in Fort Riley, a lieutenant colonel named Ralph Koslerich, who was watching the speech and thought, we're going to be the differences. My guys, my battalion, and me, because that's where they were headed, into the Surge. And a few weeks later, they got on some buses, and the buses led to an airport, and then they got on some planes, and then they got on some helicopters into Baghdad, into East Baghdad, and their war began. And before I explain a little bit about who these guys were and what happened to them, I'm going to do what any good modern writer does. I'm going to turn to a video to explain it. If you've ever wondered what the Surge felt like, this is what it felt like. Blue sky, hot temperatures, another mission to get from here to there, another convoy. Each convoy had 4 or 5 Humvees. Each Humvee had 4 or 5 soldiers inside. Each soldier was wearing 70 pounds of gear. They always wore body armor that encased them in thick ceramic plates. They wore bullet-resistant glasses, heat-resistant gloves, knee pads, and elbow pads. They carried tourniquets, bandages, 240 rounds of ammunition, and grenades. All of them carried an assault rifle. Some of them carried good luck charms. Some would sit with one foot in front of the other, so if a roadside bomb went off, they might lose 1 foot instead of 2. Sometimes they joked about what their last words would be. But always, every day, they would get in their Humvees and off they would go. This day, the trip was from one base in eastern Baghdad to another, along a road called Route Pluto. They drove at 10 miles per hour, maybe 15, to increase chances of finding a bomb before it went off. Finally, almost there, the first Humvee turned right off the main road. You can see it in the distance right now. There it goes. And then... This day there were some injuries, but no deaths. Other days were different, but every day felt like this in the Surge. This is what could happen at any moment. This is what it was like. It is what it was like. And the soldiers, of course, didn't know that at the beginning. You're 19 years old. You're filled with bravado, a sense of mission, some version of patriotism, some sense that you're going to go win this thing. And really, I guess in the end, a combination of naivety and invincibility. And they thought nothing bad was going to happen to them. And then, you know, what happened was what always happens in war. The war began for them. They lost a guy, and then they lost their second guy. And as they tried to carry out this counterinsurgency strategy, which has to do with, number one, make the population feel safe, and that's the way to win a war. the very streets they were going into to make the population feel safe made them feel less and less safe. Because they were seeded with so many roadside bombs, they simply couldn't get them all. They got a lot of them, thanks to jamming devices, thanks to all kinds of things on Humvees, but they couldn't get them all. So here's the deal. In this part of Baghdad, in East Baghdad, the weapon of choice it's a type of roadside bomb called an explosively formed penetrator, EFP. You know, it's a rather benign, almost like a neutered name for a really insidious device, and rather simple. It was a shape charge. It cost maybe $100 to make. And to be really simplistic about it, it was a tube filled with explosives. One end of the tube, typically out comes a wire, and the wire leads across the ground. It might wrap around a palm tree or two, through the shadows, finally into the hand of a guy who's waiting for a convoy of American soldiers to hit the perfect aiming point that he had pre-selected, somewhere in the distance. And when a truck gets there, hits the trigger. Other end of this thing, there's it was typically a piece of copper, a copper disc about the size of a dinner plate. Sometimes a little smaller, sometimes there were one, sometimes there were several. Boom. This thing is propelled forward at such a high velocity, it becomes almost liquid, it becomes semi-molten. It's hot, and it's traveling fast. And if you could see it, I guess it would take the shape of a tadpole. And this $100 device would simply burn its way through whatever was in front of it. And if it was well aimed, what it would burn through was the very thickest up armor door, 500-pound door, of the very best Humvee the military could ship to these guys at that moment. $200,000 Humvee, $100 device, it wasn't even close. The thing would burn right through and absolutely cause chaos inside. And that's why on the video when I said, you know, there's a gunner who would stand this way, a calculated decision. I'm going to go out today with one foot in front of the other, so when the shape charge comes through, and it would come through, I'm going to lose 1 foot instead of 2. Or you'd see these guys make calculations, I'm going to ride around with my hands behind my body armor. Or they would tie a horseshoe to the grill. Or they would just, you know, they're kids, and they would laugh about what their last words would be, and then they wouldn't be laughing, and they'd get a little serious about it. But out they would go every day into these streets, learning really what we all kind of can figure out for ourselves. This is what war actually is. What I'd like to do is I'd like to have a robust question and answer period. But before that, I want to show some pictures of these guys and just tell you about a few characters in the book. If you've read it, great. If you haven't, it may interest you to read the book. But at least I want to talk about them. The way the book came about was I wrote a little story for the Post about these guys heading into the surge. I then got in touch with the battalion commander, this guy Koslerich, and said, I wanted to write a book. And I said, you have to understand, I'm a journalist, I have no agenda here. I'm not going to write a book saying the war was won, or the war was lost, or the surge was good, or the surge was bad. It's not a judgmental book. It's not a policy book. Those had come out by then. It's simply, and it's not a first-person book. It's just a book that's going to document this one unseen corner of the war. Not policy in Washington, but the far end of policy as it was being enacted and carried out every day in this little vicious part of East Baghdad. He said, you want to come over? Come on over, and if that's your promise that you don't have an agenda, my promise to you, full access to everything we're doing. And he was good to his word. These guys were there on the ground 14 months. I was on the ground with them a little over 8 months. I had the luxury of taking breaks now and then to come back to Washington to do some reporting. These guys didn't have that luxury. They were there for 18 days back home. But I was there long enough, I think, to write a book. Again, when I say observed journalism, it's based on my being there and being there long enough to, I think, get an accurate sense, not what I was going through, but what the soldiers were going through themselves. And in the end, I hope, producing a book that, you know, I had no idea if it was going to sell or just disappear completely, but to try to describe that hidden part to add to all the documentation of this war. I mean, it's a consequential war. So that later when people are combing through this war and this time to see what it was like, along with the great policy books and the memoirs and everything else, was one more book describing the day-to-day of what this war did at this point in time. So this is, that's Cosleridge, and this is in Fort Riley, and this is when it kind of really kicked in after George Bush announced the surge, and Cosleridge found out exactly where he was going. He gathered his guys, and they stood in the snow, and he told them, we're going to what I understand is a mean little vicious area of East Baghdad, and when he said that, everybody cheered, because they were so eager to get into this thing. The book begins this way, if I can read a quick excerpt. His soldiers weren't yet calling him the lost cause behind his back, not when this began. The soldiers of his who would be injured were still perfectly healthy, and the soldiers of his who would die were still perfectly alive. A soldier who was a favorite of his hadn't yet written of the war in a letter to a friend, "I've had enough of this bullshit." Another soldier, one of his best, hadn't yet written in the journal he kept hidden, "I've lost all hope. I feel the end is near for me, very, very near." Another hadn't yet gotten angry enough to shoot a thirsty dog that was lapping up a puddle of human blood. Another, who at the end of all this would become the battalion's most decorated soldier, hadn't yet started dreaming about the people he had killed and wondering if God was going to ask him about the two who had been climbing a ladder. Another hadn't yet started seeing himself shooting a man in the head, and then seeing the little girl who had just watched him shoot the man in the head every time he shut his eyes. For that matter, his own dreams hadn't started yet either, at least the ones he would remember, the ones in which his wife and friends were in a cemetery surrounding a hole into which he was suddenly falling. Those dreams would be along soon enough, but in early April 2007, Ralph Cosleridge, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel who had led a battalion of some 800 soldiers into Baghdad as part of George W. Bush's surge, was still finding a reason every day to say, "It's all good." He would wake up in eastern Baghdad, inhale its bitter, burning air, and say it, "It's all good." He would go past the blast walls, the sandbags, the bunkers, the aid station where the wounded from other battalions were treated, the annex where they assembled the dead, and say it. He would say it in his little office with its walls cracked from various explosions while reading the morning's emails. From his wife, "I love you so much. I wish we could lay naked in each other's arms, bodies meshing together, perhaps a little sweat." From his mother in rural Washington state after some surgery, everything turned out to be normal, goody goody. From his father, "I have laid awake many nights since I last saw you and have often wished I could be alongside you to assist in some way." He would say it on his way to the chapel, where he would attend Catholic Mass conducted by a priest who had to be flown in by helicopter because the previous priest was blown up in a Humvee. He would say it when he went in his Humvee into the neighborhoods of eastern Baghdad, where more and more roadside bombs were exploding now that the surge was underway, killing soldiers, taking off arms, taking off legs, causing concussions, exploding eardrums, leaving some soldiers angry and others vomiting and others in sudden tears. Not his soldiers, though, other soldiers from other battalions. "It's all good," he would say when he came back. It could seem like a nervous tic, this thing that he said, or a prayer of some sort, or maybe it was a declaration of optimism, because he was optimistic, even though he was in the midst of a war that to the American public, the American media, and even to some in the American military seemed all over in April 2007, except for the pessimism, the praying, and the nervous tics, but not to him. Well, here are the differences, George W. Bush had said, and Ralph Cosleridge had thought, will be the difference. My battalion, my soldiers, me. And every day since then, he had said it. It's all good, after which he might say the other thing he often said, always without irony and utterly convinced, we're winning. He liked to say that too, except now on April 6, 2007, at 1 a.m., as someone banged on his door, waking him up, he said something different. "What the fuck," he said, opening his eyes. This was the XO of the battalion, a guy named Brent Cummings, and I like to think that if I were ever to be a soldier or had been a soldier, Brent Cummings would be the soldier I would have liked to have been or to be. Very, very moral man. And here he was in this place, and fighting the war morally was essential to him. So much that when you meet him in the book, he's consumed with the most absurd task. His soldiers are trying to take over a building. Part of counterinsurgency was to have neighborhood outposts, basically, cops. And they had found a building where they wanted to put some guys. But when they were going through the building, they lifted up a little round thing on the ground, a little manhole cover, and they realized it was a septic tank. And when they looked in the septic tank, inside, floating, they saw the headless body of an Iraqi, and just kind of floating in this poo water, and next to him was floating his head. And Brent Cummings said, "We've got to get this body out of there." Well, no one wanted to do it. It wasn't an American body, so the Americans didn't have to do it. The Iraqis wanted nothing to do with it. But it was essential to Brent to get this guy out, because he's saying, he's certainly somebody's son, he could be somebody's husband, brother, father, whatever. If we're moral people, we have to get him out of there. By the end of the book, when everything just went to hell, and these guys were in the worst fighting of their entire deployment, there was a point when on a video screen there was a scene of an Iraqi with a semi-automatic rifle firing at an American convoy. And here came some American gunships to kill this guy, and Brent Cummings was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Die, monkey, die." Now he knows, Brent's a smart guy, he knows how offensive this is. And now he can't believe he said that. But at the time, it's the degradation any war causes. It's who he had come to by the end of this thing. He's a great guy. Izzy was one of the Iraqi nationals who served as an interpreter. And just a quick story about Izzy, he was so in love with America. He still wants to be here still, but at that point he was so in love with America that among the few possessions he carried with him wherever he went was a frequent flyer card from Pan American World Airways. So in late April, there was an operation there was a particularly restive area called Kamalaya that the soldiers were trying to bring under control a little bit. And this guy, Michael Emery, was on a rooftop when a sniper got a clean shot into his head. And he went down. He obviously not dead, but terribly, terribly wounded. And he's on this rooftop, and they've got to get him down 3 flights of stairs so they can medevac him out. And for some reason, there was a weird building, and they were having a hard time getting the litter from the ambulance up the stairs. So he was finally carried down. He was medevaced out. And first he went to Landstuhl in Germany, and then he went to Bethesda. And every day, these emails would come back, first from Germany and then from Bethesda, talking about how good Emery was doing. And it was amazing. It meant so much to these soldiers that Emery, would be an email, "He sat up today," told his wife, "I love you," gave her a kiss. And so these guys would get these little emails and think, okay, so they didn't get Emery. They're not going to get us. He's coming back. He's getting better and better. So maybe 5-6 weeks after this happened, I took a break. I came back to the States. I went to Bethesda, and I found out the truth of what an email can actually mean. So the part in the book that explores that has to do with his wife taking care of him, Maria, goes like this. "Give me your hand, baby," Maria Emery said to her husband, who was diapered, who could barely move, who had a ventilator tube inserted into his throat, who was looking in panic at his wife, armored in a mask and gown and gloves. And when she took his right hand and wrapped it around hers, he emitted a high-pitched whimper. "Are you cold?" she asked. He didn't answer, just looked at her, less panicked now. His head was as misshapen as the moon over Rustamaya. "Baby," she said, leaning closer. "Sweetheart," she said, even closer. She straightened up. He whimpered again. "So this is what I do now," she explained, of what life had been since a phone call in which the Department of Defense informed her that her husband had been shot, and now she added details by reading from a diary she'd been keeping since then. May the 3rd, I kissed him on his lips. This was in Germany. I told him, I'm going to kiss you on the lips, and if you can feel it, move. And I kissed him twice, and he moved both times. May the 6th, we got on the medevac flight, and we flew from Germany here to Bethesda. May the 17th, he opened his eyes for the very first time. May the 19th, he moved his fingers and his legs, and I told him that I loved him, and he started crying. May the 20th, he was just sleeping. May the 25th, the president came to see him. And now she put the diary down as she thought about the day that President Bush came to visit, about what he had said to her. He said, "Thank you for my husband's service to his country," and he was sorry for what our family was going through. About what she had said to him, "Thank you for coming." About what she wished she had said to him, that he didn't understand what we're going through because he doesn't know how it feels, and that I didn't agree with what was going on with the war. About why she hadn't said it, because I felt it wouldn't have made any difference. And my husband, of course, had his eyes open, and I didn't want him getting upset. About what Bush didn't understand. I mean, when I saw him, I was so angry, I started crying, and he saw me and came to me and gave me a hug and said, "Everything's going to be okay." That was why he came over to her, she said, because he misunderstood the reason for her tears. He'd had no idea they were because of anger, and he'd had no idea they were because of him. And nothing was okay, she said, so he was wrong about that too. Her husband was ruined. In 7 weeks, she had lost so much weight that her dress size had gone from a 12 to a 6. Her daughter was now living with a relative. She was now living in a hospital. The doctors were saying it could be years before her husband was better, if ever, and hope, if it existed at all, had to be extracted from wherever it could. From the awful day, for instance, in which he lifted his right hand, placed it on her shoulder, and then tried to move it across her breasts, and then started to cry. So many tears in this place, and now there were more as he closed his eyes and dozed off, and she knew he couldn't see her. She stepped out of the room. She removed the gloves, the gown, the mask. She hurried to a vending machine to get something to eat, and then came right back so she'd be next to him when he woke up. Gown back on, mask back on, gloves back on, waiting. He opened his eyes. For a moment there was alarm. Then he saw her. There she was, as if she hadn't moved. "Can you give me a kiss?" she said. "Can you give me a kiss?" She leaned in until her mask was against his lips. So when Emery was shot, and they had to get him down the 3 flights of stairs, Adam Schumann put him on his back and carried him down the stairs in kind of a fireman's carry. And Adam Schumann, he was on his 3rd deployment. He had been in country about 1,000 days. He was pretty well regarded as one of the very best soldiers in this battalion. Big old Emery. Put him on his back, carried him down 3 flights of stairs. Because of the angle of things, a lot of blood coming out of Emery's head kept going into Adam Schumann's mouth as he huffed and puffed his way down the stairs. Gets him down. 6 months later, he's still tasting this blood. And because of that and some other things, he couldn't do it anymore. It was time to go. Severe, no question about it. Even among these tough guys, there was no doubt that this guy was a legitimate, severe case of a guy who just couldn't do it anymore, severe PTSD. So I was with him. Well, this is right before he left. And a little bit after this, packed up. He had said goodbye to his guys, his team. He's walking to the landing area to come home, and where the helicopters land. Stops, calls his wife, says he's on his way. She says, "I'm afraid of what you're going to do to me." And he hangs up and he says, "I'm afraid of what I might do to her as well." Goes to the landing zone. There may be 6 guys in line. Here come the helicopters, big sound, dust, blah, blah, blah. Land. Everybody moves forward to get on these helicopters. Schumann gets to the front of the line, hand. The guy yells, "It's not your helicopter." Everybody else gets on. Helicopters leave. Now Adam Schumann's just standing there by himself. Here comes the next set of helicopters. Big red crosses on the side, the helicopters for the injured and the dead. And that's when Schumann, he finally gets it. That's him. He's injured, he's dead, he's done. Gets on the helicopters, comes back. I don't know, maybe a year later, I was out visiting some of the guys. I saw Schumann. I said, "How you doing?" He said, "Well, I was a normal guy who went to Iraq and I became crazy. And so they sent me back to America to become normal, and now it's America that's driving me crazy. So that was enough for me. You know, I'm working on another book now, the second volume of this story, which Schumann will be a main character and a few other guys as well. But, you know, he's at it. He's not well. He's trying, but so far not so good. Before I talk about this guy, I want to tell one other story. And you know, even though the Maria Emery part, she was not crazy about George W. Bush. I'm serious when I say the book is not a political book. It's not a book with an agenda. Each chapter starts with a quote from Bush, something Bush said about the time the rest of the chapter unfolds. And you know, I've gotten dinged a little bit. People think I'm trying to make fun of Bush because what he says is often in opposition to what happens. And it's not the case at all. I mean, I don't know what George Bush went through. And I'm not trying to stain his reputation or make fun of him in any way. What I am trying to show is, and if anybody here who's served, you know this as well as anyone, that any war is really several wars. And the Iraqis have their own versions of this. But on the American side, there's the war as it's being fought in Washington, in the Pentagon, in Congress, strategy, money, politics. And then there's the other war as it's being fought on the ground. And there was, of all the days to get to this, I think the one that makes it most clear, the distance between these two was September 4th, 2007, when George W. Bush lands in Australia, is asked how the war is going, and his answer that day was, "We're kicking ass." And the book doesn't quarrel with that. It doesn't argue against it. To Bush, September 4th, that was the war. We're kicking ass. To these guys, September 4th was the day another patrol went out, another EFP went off. This time, 3 guys were dead on the spot. A 4th lost both of his legs above the knee. And a 5th was a 19-year-old guy named Duncan Crookston. Duncan, in that moment, became somebody who lost both of his legs all the way up, his entire right arm, his left arm down to about here, and what little remained of Duncan was of course, badly burned. He was airlifted, Landstuhl, then to Brooke Army Medical Center to be taken care of by his mother and his young wife, who basically pick up their lives and move to this place, to this burn unit. The months go by. Every guy gets 18 days to go home in this deployment. Ralph Koslerich goes home at the end of the year, goes to Disney World, sees his family. At the end of it, he goes to Brooke Army Medical Center to see his wounded soldiers. There were a dozen or so, including Duncan. And the day he walked into Duncan's room, it was about the only time I've been with him in years and years now where he hasn't said it's all good. Because when he walked in the room, what he saw, as I say in the book, it just didn't make sense. It was a full-size hospital bed, propped up, and monitors, everything you can imagine. Mother over here, wife over here, gowned up, in we go. And there's Duncan, and it's just wrapped in bandages. And it's like half of a man bolted to a full-size bed, if that makes sense. Duncan at that point, 30 surgeries. His ears had fallen off. His nose had fallen off. Eyebrows, eyelids. He was wearing these goggles because his eyes couldn't produce moisture anymore. These kind of self-misting goggles. So Koslerich walks in and sees this man, this half a man in this bed, and basically under his breath says, "Bastards." Goes in. Talks to Crookston for a while, whose eyes are open behind these goggles, but not responding at all. And there's all this stuff going around. His mom Lee talking to him, his wife talking to him. He's just there. Koslerich is talking to him. We're winning the war. No response. Thanks to you, thanks to all you've done, I've got some medals for you, blah, blah, blah. No response. Finally, at the end of this, Koslerich says, well, I'm leaving from here, going to the airport, going back to Iraq. And I'm going to finish this war and win it, because that's my job. And your job is to get better. Do you understand me? The slightest nod. And of everything I saw in my 8 months, I can't imagine anything more devastating, because that was the moment when he responded that he got it. You know, he knew. He knew who he was, he knew what had happened to him, he knew where he was, he knew it all. So Koslerich finishes, leaves, goes to the airport, he's done with his leave, flies back to Baghdad, goes into his office, resumes the war, turns on his computer. There's an email from Duncan's mother, Lee Crookston, that begins, Duncan just died. And the end of it, I think, is the most beautiful line in the book. She said, after explaining what happened, the guy was a day away from his 20th birthday. So she ends the email saying, Duncan would have been 20 tomorrow, 20 years old tomorrow. He'll be forever 19 now and forever missed. So, September 4th, 2 versions. We're kicking ass. That is legitimate. But to these guys, September 4th is the day 3 died, another lost his legs, and the creation of the final version of Duncan Crookston. And I tell you this because, you know, one of the things I hope this book does is, you know, it's very easy not to pay attention to this war. 1% of the country is specifically engaged, directly involved in the war, a little less than 1%. I mean, go into a neighborhood, knock on 99 doors. No, we don't have anybody in the war. It's not like they're shutting down factories to build MRAPs, which are far better against EFPs. Not like there's a whole lot of economic sacrifice, even though it is so costly. It's tangential involvement in most families. And it's very easy to get to the paper, read the post, see a headline that says 3 killed in East Baghdad or 3 killed in Afghanistan. Okay, fine. Pause for a minute, kind of sad. Maybe that's all we can do. But underneath these deaths is the story of Duncan Crookston every single time. So forgive me for going off course, but I do like mentioning that. A little preachy. Anyway, here's Nate Shulman. Great soldier. At the end of their deployment, nothing had happened for a while, and these guys, almost to a man, were thinking that what they had done did make a difference. Things were quiet. Things were better in East Baghdad. And then everything just really did go to hell. They were packing up to go home. They were done. And instead of packing for something that happened way down in southern Iraq that had nothing to do with them, and it shivered its way all the way up into East Baghdad outside of Sadr City, these guys were in, forget coin strategy, these guys were in flat-out warfare for 10 days. And during this period, 2 more soldiers died, another EFP, including a guy named Patrick Miller, P.J. Miller, the one I knew the best. Really, just wonderful guy. Dead in a convoy that was led by this guy, Nate Shulman. So one last quick excerpt from the book. This has to do with things calmed down enough, and Shulman came back to the forward operating base, FOB Rustamaya. In another part of the FOB, Nate Shulman was writing. Ray baby, he wrote to his new wife. He had come in with blood on his boots and a sadness so thorough that he'd been unable to speak, even when a few soldiers asked him how he was doing. His answer was to shake his head and stare at the ground. He had spent the rest of the day in isolation, and only now had he found some words he wanted to say, writing to his wife, I'm going to need some help when I get home. He slept only a little that night, even though he was exhausted, and the next day, at Koslerich's request, he went reluctantly to the operations center for debriefing. I'm just trying to figure out what the hell happened, Koslerich said, getting right to it. And when Shulman looked at him in silence, Koslerich said quietly, if you would, just talk me through. So Shulman began by telling Koslerich about what Patrick Miller was doing just before he died, that he was standing outside of his Humvee eating a date that he'd been given by an Iraqi national policeman. The last thing I saw of little Miller, is how he put it, and he didn't bother to explain that Miller was called Little Miller to differentiate him from Big Miller, a soldier with a back so hairy that there would be bets among soldiers over who would be brave enough to lick it. Or about the night his soldiers woke him up and there was Little Miller dancing in front of him, naked except for sunglasses, an M4, a bandana, and a thong, and laughing hysterically as he chanted, "I'm ready to fight the terrorists." All of the soldiers were laughing, and he had laughed too. He'd been crazy about Miller. Little Miller was putting a can of gas in the trunk. The national guy gave him a date, he said, and he didn't bother with the rest of it, that the reason the Iraqi gave him a date was out of gratitude. And the reason for the gratitude was that the Americans had come to save him. And the reason that the Americans had come to save him was because they had been trying to save him since 2003, when the number of dead American soldiers was 0, and Patrick Miller was 19 years old and about to start college and thinking that he was going to become a doctor. And instead, he took a date and ate it and gave the guy the thumbs up and got back in the truck, Showman said. And then the truck took off on a route that Showman had just thought of, which led straight into an exploding EFP. You know, not every day was bad. Most days were fine, although every day carried the chance of it becoming bad very quickly. There were a lot of bad days, but there were a lot of, fine days. These were 19-year-olds. They were smart. They were stupid. They were funny. They were idiots. They were mooks. I was talking earlier. There was a day when there was an inspection. General order number 1: no liquor, no porn. Well, one guy very helpfully had a CD in which he had taken out a Sharpie and very helpfully written on it, porn. They were great. They were idiots, and there was a day when there was this Soldier of the Month competition in which sergeants could ask privates whatever they want to ask, and privates, if they want to get promoted, they got to be ready to answer. They have to know everything in order to get to a promotion board. That would make these guys so nervous. And then came one guy, red hair, full kit, sweating like crazy, so nervous, and the sergeant said to him, "Tell me the 4 places on the body to take a pulse." And this kid goes, "The neck, the wrist, the ankle, the anus." So there they were, fighting this war. This guy, could he be more relaxed? Jaeger taking a picture of this guy, they're just drawn back and forth. It's a normal time. In this battalion, 14 times, those pictures turned into thieves. There's Crookston, by the way, Miller. So, I don't know, 800 guys, 14 died. It's not exactly Vietnam numbers, right? 14 died. 10% serious Purple Hearts. Those are the physical injuries. I can tell you that many, many more have all kinds of mental wounds. Some crippling, some okay. Some are doing okay. Some are really, really bad. Most inhabit this middle area where they're not thinking about whether they won or whether they lost or whether the surge worked or didn't work. They're thinking about who they became. They're trying to make sense of what happened in this 15-month period when they went from being those young men standing in the snow to, in some cases, much older men standing in front of flags like that. That's the book. It's a very simple book. They went, things happened, they came home. And it's again, the intent was just, not dispassionately, because obviously I'm emotional about this, but to journalistically, honestly, chronicle this corner, get it down for the record, let it be part of the archive of this war. That's the book. I went on a little long, but I hope you all have some questions and we can talk a little longer.
You must have been in great danger. Tell us about how you survived.
Well, yes, everybody there at some point was in danger, but so I was in a couple things, but the point is, the soldiers themselves were in many, many more things. and much more frequently than I was. And so, I'm not trying to deflect, I'm just trying to sort of move the emphasis back to where it was. How did they survive is the question. How do they survive? What do they become because of this experience? What happens to any man in any war? I got lucky a few times. I started out pretty gung-ho. I was out all the time in convoys, and then by the end of it, after being in some explosions and the rest of it, I just wasn't going out very much. I feel badly about that because, good journalism, you go out all the time. Something might happen. And by the end, I had made the decision, I'm not going to go out anymore unless there's a really good chance of seeing something I hadn't seen before. It was a calculation, and the best journalism doesn't have to do with calculations. It's throwing calculations away and just going. So I had an advantage. I was saying this earlier. I had several luxuries the soldiers didn't have. One is I didn't carry a weapon, and that's quite a big difference. Number two, I got to take breaks every month or so when I found myself being a bad reporter. It had just gotten to me. I could take a break. I could come back to the States to do reporting. I could wait for a helicopter, take it to the green zone, get in a convoy, go out to the Washington Post Baghdad Bureau. I could sleep in for a couple days, not worry about rocket attacks, mortar attacks for the most part, drink, sleep late, get a hangover, get my head together, and then go back. And I wasn't limited to 18 days. And at the end of it, and this is a really important point, I got to come home and spend 11 months writing this book, which meant that every day for 11 months, I had to wake up and make sense of this chronology, turn it into a narrative truth, confront it, consider it. And that was really cathartic. That was an amazing thing to be able to do. So, of course, it changed me. This was a profound thing, but not in a crippling way. Soldiers, again, some are fine, some aren't, but none got that luxury of being put in a place and told, okay, here's some money, consider it now, consider everything you went through and who you became. So it's kind of a wandering answer, but I got through it fine, and so did most of the soldiers, as happens.
To write the book, or did you just decide to write the book after you came back?
No, I wasn't going to go unless I had a book and a book contract and disability insurance. So once I lined those babies up, off I went. No, the idea, I took a leave from the Post. It was a 2-year leave. The intent was, I didn't know if anything would happen. These guys said, come. And who knew what was going to happen? What did happen, if you read the book, I think you'll see, if it had been a piece of fiction, people would just dismiss it as, this is way too amped. This is not the way it goes. It is the way it went. I mean, if you read it, well, you did start it, and thank you, but if you keep going, everything in there, it's true. The names are real, the quotes are real, the events were almost entirely observed. When they weren't, they were documented. This is a controversial war. I wanted to make sure that I produced a work that if people tried to attach politics to it, accused me of whatever they might accuse me of, I could back it up with documents and make my case about why this is to my mind, to my standards, a valid piece of journalism. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about your family's reaction to your taking this on, whether they were supportive of it, and is there any chance that you're at risk of PTSD from having lost people that you were close to?
I don't know. I mean, I go back and forth. I went through periods where I was a little startled by noises and stuff like that. But no, I think I'm all right. As for my family, this is always everybody's got to have a cheap joke, right? My cheap joke is, I've been married for 30 years. One day my wife looked at her watch and said, don't you have a war to go to? Yeah, like I said. So they were worried, but they knew that for whatever reason I wanted to do this. I feel like my career, which had gone pretty well, sort of kind of led up to this, and maybe because of the work I've done, the approach I took, the books I've read growing up, my interest, the Pulitzer, whatever it was, I got to be the one to go to this unseen place, and that meant a lot to me. My family understood that. My kids were in college at that point, so they were doing college things, and the hard part for my wife was we could email a little bit, but I was afraid that my email was being monitored, not necessarily by the government, but it was just such a sketchy arrangement. It was some Iraqi national who came on and charged an enormous amount for a bad internet connection, and you just didn't know who was looking at what you wrote. So I was very careful in my emails. I also had a cell phone, but the only place on this fob where I could get more than one bar was to stand in a field that was the field that was always being mortared. So you like run out, everything's fine here, and then the horn would go off, well, chow time. That was that.
Hi,
Hi.
David. My name is Christy Kaufman, Army wife, and I really appreciate the stories that you tell of both the caregivers and the families at home. And I think the book that you're working on is following up on the home front. If I could, I just wanted to address and maybe share a little bit with everybody in the audience what it's like to be a military family member these days. There's an entire generation of us now, myself included, that got married just 2 months before September 11th, that really knows nothing but war. I don't know what marriage would be like without war. You have children that don't know what childhood would be without war. So the stories that you share in your book, and I'm sure that the second book that you're going to be working on, that will come out more. I try to figure out an analogy to describe to civilians, because my civilian friends always ask me what it's like. You know, when you're driving on a highway and you see a cop car in the rearview mirror and you see the lights go off and you get that thing in your chest. Have that feeling for 10 years straight.
Yeah.
That's what it's been like. And because when they're there, you're obviously worried about what's going on. When they're back, and the effects of these wars are cumulative. And we're going to see with the reintegration and with the longer dwell time, the impacts on the home front are going to be significant. We're talking a lot about the suicides of the service members.
Yeah.
A lot of wives are killing themselves.
When I talk on the video or now about the soldier strategies, going out like this, there were just as many strategies back here for how to deal with the day if you're a family member in this battalion, in any battalion, and of course you know this. So one thing this next book will do, the second volume of the story, it's not in Iraq. It doesn't begin there and end there. It begins here 3 years later, 2.5 years later, and unlike that one, where families sort of floated in a little in and out, they're front and center in this book. What's going on now? So it's not going to, you're going to know more than any book can tell you. But I think you'll recognize some of what you go through, have gone through, and what your friends are going through in this next book. I hope so. These are really good people to write about, and they're very honest about what they've been going through, and we'll see how it goes. But I'm glad you pointed out what you did, and I thank you for that. Yes, sir.
I'm Chuck Morley. During Vietnam, there was, of course, a lot of discussion about racial tension and maximum use of drugs and alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera. But I sense, at least from the home front, that has not been the case in Iraq and the current army to the degree that it was in Vietnam. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Not to the degree, no, but I wouldn't, don't assume that these are all angels and there's nothing going on. There was some, in this battalion, guys managed to find liquor. There were a few guys who were really abusing steroids, interestingly. But it's different. It's I don't know why. I was just reading this piece this morning. Somebody sent me. It was published in one of the British papers. And it talked about how there's a much lower incidence of PTSD among British troops, even British troops who have been in the thick of it, than American troops. Like, I might have this wrong, but like 7 times higher among American troops. It's really interesting. Now, this thing goes on, and it suggests that perhaps the reason is that, unlike in previous wars, there's almost an expectation now here that a soldier is coming home with PTSD. And so when you re-enter a culture where the expectation is you're going to be wounded, eventually you're going to be wounded. And I don't know if that's true or not. I'm interested, and I want to do some research into it. But I mean, we might be the same age. I had my draft number, my lottery number at the end of Vietnam. I was in high school, didn't get called. I was in the 200s, and then the war fizzled out, and that was that. So I didn't have to go. But I did see, in my stupid, naive way, guys come home, and I would kind of keep them at a distance, you know. And I don't know, things changed. That war, they're all the same, but I guess, well, that's a lame thing to say, that they're all different. I don't know. The guys would find ways to medicate themselves after they had been through what they had been through. They would seal off. Some guys, I'm sure, found some hash or something. I don't think there were a lot of psychedelics or anything. Some guys drank. There's a chapter in the book devoted to what a platoon did for a week when they were brought back, when it was a bad day. After some deep buried IEDs blew up, and Humvee goes up in the air, comes down on fire, everybody gets out except for one guy, a 19-year-old, a sweet kid who burns to death. And you got to wait so you get called back to the FOB until there's a memorial ceremony, which was mandatory. And the first time I went to one, I thought, oh, the guys love these things. The guys hated these things. And part of the reason they hated them was because it was compulsory to go, and they would go in there, and they just wanted to grieve privately, and instead they had to wait for day after day after day until a general arrived. There was a rule that a general had to be present, and this rule came about when there weren't that many deaths. But at this point, there were so many deaths, and that you had to wait till the general arrived. And these guys, I think they were on the FOB for maybe 7, 8, 9 days, and it basically chronicles what they did during that week to cope with this excruciating period of time, waiting to just get that ceremony over with so they could get back in the field and go back to having the release of being a soldier. Different wars, different releases, same dynamic. Yes.
You know, this isn't like TV. There must have been a really, there must have been a medic on every, team that went out, because it's impressive that these guys can have both legs, an arm, 2 arms.
Yeah.
And they not die. They not hemorrhage to death. I mean, you must have seen that. I mean, people must just work so quickly. To think you can save these people is pretty impressive.
Well, it was an urban area, unlike Afghanistan, where it's being fought more at the platoon level than the battalion level, and in these valleys that are a little tougher to get to with helicopters. And so there's a greater chance there to bleed out, I think, than there was in Iraq, although it certainly happened, and it happened in this battalion. But helicopters could often get there, or there were enough field hospitals around to get a wounded guy there pretty quickly, like Emory or whoever. It's interesting. Lately, it took a long time to gain the trust of these soldiers. Because even though the battalion commander sort of certified the project, here comes a reporter from the Washington Post, and preceded not by the reality of what a reporter from the Washington Post is, but by suspicions of what a reporter must be. I was there because I was there being paid by the battalion commander to write his biography. Not true, but that's what a lot of guys thought. There was a rumor that anytime any guy talked to me, I would immediately leave and go back to the battalion commander and just spill everything. Not true, but there was that rumor. They went on and on, and I guess the way I gained trust finally. Let's see if I can make this point quickly. One, I stayed. I wasn't a reporter who dropped in for a day or a weekend or a week and pretended I knew anything. I stayed and stayed and stayed until I think the book I wrote is a version of their truth rather than just a version of some suburbanite from Silver Spring, Maryland. My truth. So that helped, and then when I was in bad things, and the dust settled and the smoke cleared, and I was there taking notes rather than screaming, rather than becoming a problem for the soldiers. When the dust cleared and they saw a guy at the edge with a recorder out or taking notes, that helped them understand what a reporter is supposed to do. I didn't become a problem. I did my job. But it really wasn't until the book came out that a little late in the game here, but it's not like every soldier loves this book, but a lot of them have emailed me from that battalion and other battalions and said a version of, so I was there too. And when I came home, everyone asks, what was it like? And I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to tell them, and I can't talk about it. But I read your book, and I'm going to give them your book and say, read this thing, and you'll understand what it was like and why I can't talk about it. So there has been finally a layer or a level of trust established, but man, it took a long time. That's not quite an answer to the question, but something to say. Yes?
What was the most frustrating thing for these soldiers? And were they fighting the war the way they wanted to fight it?
Some bought into coins. Some thought it was ridiculous. That the most frustrating thing for them is we're here trying to help them. Why do they keep trying to blow us up? And there is a legitimate answer to that question. That's not seeing it from the other side. That's seeing it from their side. But that's legitimate too. We're here to help. Why do they keep trying to kill us? And then that eventually became, they're setting off all these bombs, but we're the only targets. So if we just leave, they'll stop setting off the bombs. They were always just trying to work their way through it. But the frustrating thing was, why is this happening? And so what happened is, again, what happens? They went from a sense of mission, naive mission in the beginning, and by the end, the only reason they were there, most of these guys would say the only reason they were there, had nothing to do with mission, patriotism, forget that. That's all out the window. They were only there because the guy next to them is there, and they love this guy next to them, and they're going to be there together. That's always what happens, and that's what happened here as well.
Hi, David. I think you answered one of my questions in your previous explanation, but trying to think of something else, but also combining that, I guess I would ask, what is most of their views of the world, of the war now that they fought in, and how do they feel about you sharing their stories?
If you have 800 guys, you're going to have 800 opinions about whether this worked or whether it didn't. And some, Kosrich he believes that what they did over there helped turn the tide. He's a brilliant guy with a healthy ego, and he thinks that what they did matters, changed things. There are other guys who think that's complete nonsense. But like I said earlier, most of the guys inhabit this very large, kind of shaky terrain in between those two extremes where they're just not sure. They're just not sure what they accomplished, and even more importantly, what it did to them, who they became. One of the guys I'm writing about in the next book, he says, I'm trying to figure out the monster I became over there. What happened? Why did I act that way? There's another guy, listen to this. He wasn't in the first book, but he was in the Humvee that blew up that day. When I was talking about the platoon that spent a week trying to deal with what happened? Okay. This is a great guy. Thing blows up, comes down. This guy is thrown out of the Humvee with a broken leg. Even as the dust is coming down, it's still this kind of almost vulgar brown color. He's making his way back to the Humvee. He pulls two guys out. As the Humvee catches on fire, rounds are cooking off, he saves them. He can't get to the driver either. And they fix his leg. I was with him in the aid station when they were working on him, and I was with him. Nobody was with him, so I stood next to him when a buddy came by, and he said, well, what about Harrelson? Head shake, and that's, when he understood Harrelson had died. He gets through the deployment. He's gets through almost another deployment. And then one day he's back here on leave, and he just, something happens, and he just loses it and ends up for a week in a lockdown facility, psychiatric facility. And then he's gone through various programs just trying to get himself back together. And we were talking, and I said, so what is the thing that, what is it? What's the haunting thing here? He said, it's just this dream. And I have it at least once a week, and it's usually more, and it's the same dream, and it's Harrelson, and he's on fire, and he's saying to me, why didn't you save me? And I said, do you ever dream about the guys you did save? And he said, well, you can't really control your dreams, can you? So that's a great guy who saved 2 guys, but he is just held hostage by dreams of the one he didn't save. That's a consequential thing. That shouldn't be ignored. And you know, I want to do the next book, I guess, because we can think the war is over. There's some arguments that it is. There are arguments that it isn't. If you're an Iraqi, it's not over. You know, it's not so good over there. Bombs are going off every day. It's not like you have a lot of electricity. Life, maybe Saddam is gone, but you're not living a great life so far. And for these guys, the war is anything but over. You know, it's back here. Maybe it's left Iraq. The American version has mostly left Iraq, but it's undeniably here now, moving into American communities, and we get to see the effects of that for quite some time, and I hope contend with it in a very, very compassionate way.
Yeah, I believe you said you were at Yorktown High School today.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what their reaction to, because they're the ones coming up that will have something to do with what goes on
Right.
Later. So did you get
Well, I don't know. It was a special group. These were, they worked for the school paper. So I was basically talking to them and say, you know, go out there. If you stick with this, go to the hard place, the unseen place, be a witness, tell the truth, you know, that kind of message. So it was a bit corny, but heartfelt, and that's what I was trying to get across. It's really nice when I go to colleges to talk about this book, because I can always start the same way. You know, this is about the people your age who aren't here at Kansas State, who aren't here at Century, aren't here at American. You know, they're the ones who, because of various things, instead of being here at K-State having a good time, they went a few miles away to Fort Riley, and then they lifted off. It's really, I like doing that. You know, and it's not a guilt trip or anything. It's just, I'm just trying to get across what you all know. I mean, look, you all get this. You know this. You know, we live here. We're all engaged in policy. We're smart as can be when we live here, on and on. We read the paper. We probably, some of you here are probably in the paper. You decide the things that are in the paper. You just help decide the policies. So it's not like we're ignorant of what goes on, but I still think it's, whether it's here or anywhere, it's just helpful to remind people that the war isn't a faraway thing, or it can't be considered a faraway thing. You can love the war, you can hate well, nobody loves war. You can think it's justified, you can think it's silly, but attention, you know, Willie Loman here, attention ought to be paid, right? So, who has a microphone? Yes.
This is not a question, but just a comment. You said a few minutes ago that they were all felt like they weren't fighting for patriotism or anything. They were fighting for their
the guy
buddies
next
to him. As just comment that is exactly what Tim O'Brien said in the things they carried.
Yeah.
He's going to be here next week, and practically word for word.
Yeah, that's what happens, huh? That's what it comes to. Vietnam, World War. I mean, I've read so many books before I went. To see what I might be getting myself into, how this story, the various ways it's been told over the years, and they all seem to come down to that as a pretty common element. In the end, it's not that they lost their patriotism. It had nothing to do with that anymore. They had seen too much. They had learned too much. You know, there's some Army study says, you know, a typical 24-year-old serving right now, 2 deployments, God knows what they've been through. They basically have the experience, the life experience of an 80-year-old man, what they've been through. And it's actually more credible than the way I'm describing it. You look at all the things and you kind of think, well, that kind of makes sense. So it's not that by the end these were naive, dumb guys, but that is what it came down to. I'm here because of the guy next to me, and the hell with the rest of it. And it's an interesting thing. Anybody? Yes, there's a microphone. Hang on one second. A lot of them. You know, there was a thing over there where, so you come back from a memorial ceremony sometimes, and later that night or the next day there would be a ceremony, a guy re-upping, because, well, all right, so you're some guy from Sandusky, Ohio, and you're about to go home from the surge, and your time's about up, and you're going back to a lousy economy and no jobs. Or here's the Army trying to hit its numbers and offering bonuses and saying, if you sign up right now, this month's figure, $12,000. And by the way, if you do it now while you're in Iraq, it's tax-free. You know, that's good salesmanship. A lot of guys, they did the math. They knew the right thing to do. And so there would be these amazing ceremonies, just a couple of guys, you know, holding up a little flag, and the guy standing in front with his hand in the air, swearing, taking the oath again. And so I think they kept a chart on the bonuses paid in this battalion. I think by the end of it, it was either over $2 million or $3 million in bonuses for these guys to re-up. So
Is that 4 years re-up?
the longer you stay, the more you get. 6 years, you're getting some serious money if you're facing unemployment in Sandusky, Ohio. And, you know, that's a pretty smart thing to do. Army has to fight a war. The Army needs its numbers, and the waiver cases, this is interesting. The waiver cases at that point in 2007, it was something like 18%, which meant that because the Army had to hit a number, a certain number of soldiers to fight this war, 18% of the guys who came in needed a waiver to get in, needed basically to be excused from some past behavior. In a full Army, these guys never would have gotten in. Drug convictions, drinking, driving things. There were, you know, a couple of extreme cases of sexual assaults. There might have been a homicide or two. But they got in, and I can tell you that some of these guys were absolutely and are absolutely ruined by what happened to them there. And I also saw guys who were they were lost souls before they went in, and who they became over there was extraordinary. You know, the discipline, whatever it was, the being in something. What you would see these guys who were headed to a really bad life get in this place, and in some cases they became the great men they never would have been otherwise. I feel that's a fair thing to say. So again, you know, the extreme. Yeah, hey, I'm sorry.
Hi, could you touch a bit more on these men that you got to know? How did this experience affect their view?
Affect them?
Affect their sense of being in the military, being a soldier?
It taught them, I think it's fair to say it taught them what being a soldier actually is, rather than what they imagined it to be. It's not a video game. It's not romantic. It's not all about saving the day and being a hero. They learned all that ugliness. You know, they grew up, and I think it's fair to say they grew up. A lot of them stayed in. You know, they're in now. They like being in there. It's confusing, though, because I say that, and then I can think of anecdotes that confuse the whole thing. There's one guy who I was talking to, like, around Christmas at Fort Riley, and, you know, we hadn't seen each other in a while. Hey, man, how you doing? We met in a bar. I just happened to walk in the bar at the end of the day. I wanted a steak and a drink, and in Junction City, Kansas, there's only one place to go that doesn't have a drive-in window, and it's this place. So I went in, and this guy had been in there, I think it was like 10 p.m. He had been in there since noon just drinking. And I said, so what's going on? He said, no, I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. A little drunk, but I'm headed back to Afghanistan. I said, good. What do you think about that? He said, I'm excited. I said, okay. So you're doing all right? He said, I'm doing great. I said, how's your sleep? He said, well, I have some nightmares. I wake up screaming a lot. And, you know, it disintegrated from there. He's nervous. He's on like 6 medications, antidepressives, anxiety drugs, you know, the usual cocktail. I said, so why are you going back? He said, I think it's the only place that makes sense to me. I got to go back, and I want to finish the job and be a leader. I said, are you putting your guys in danger the way you are? He said, I'm sure I'll be fine. There's another guy, his name was Fredera, who, when I saw Crookston, when I was with Koslerich and went to Brooke Army Medical Center, and he visited his wounded soldiers, there was a guy, I'm sorry, it wasn't Fredera, it was Looning, and lost part of a foot in an explosion. And this guy, you know, it's just, it was so important to him to rehab and stay in the Army and get to the fight, to get to Afghanistan. And, you know, God damn it, he did it. You know, he rehabbed and rehabbed and rehabbed. And he got sent out of Brooke Army Medical Center. He was fine, sent over to Afghanistan. And there he was back in there. And not so long ago, he was on a street corner when somebody walked up with a suicide vest and detonated it. And that's the end of Looney. He's dead. Isn't that weird? It was so important to him to get back. You know, most guys go back, and that doesn't happen, but it also does happen. Yes, somebody, yes.
Can you tell us where Colonel Koslerich is
Yeah,
today? And has his rank changed?
Has his
Rank changed? Is
yeah,
he
he's a full colonel now. He did another deployment at the division level. He was in southern Iraq. Just got back from that recently. He's headed to next, I think, to the War College in Pennsylvania. I just saw him the other day, and he's doing fine, he says. He's doing fine. Brent Cummings, it's interesting, he's also doing fine, except every night before he goes to sleep, you know, that little moment when you drop off, he screams. And he's not aware of it, but his wife, you know, says every night. And he says, no, I'm okay. But every night, right when he hits that point, he screams, and then he just falls into a dead sleep.
You guys, I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so that's going to have to be the last question for the evening. Sorry. Yeah, please come over for the book signing. Thank you all for coming.
Well, can I just say one more thing? I just really, well, good. They're still playing tennis. Really, thank you for coming. I just appreciate it so much. I'm glad you did.
Thank you.